Okay, so for our lesson today, we're looking at solving quadratic equations. Now, you did this when you were in Algebra 1, and today is going to kind of be a throwback day to review some of the skills that you use to solve quadratic equations. So right now, what I want you to do is I want you to pause the video and I want you to complete the do now. I want you to solve for x, part A, and part B. Okay, at this point, you unpaused and you've already completed the do now yourself and you're trying to check your answers. So, what you should notice here is they already factored for us. If I have something that's already been factored and it's set equal to 0, I just need to set each of my factors equal to 0. So x plus 1 equals 0 and x minus 5 equals 0. And I need to solve for x. So here I would subtract 1 on both sides and get negative 1. Here I would add 5 on both sides and get positive 5. So my two answers are negative 1 and positive 5. Okay, for the next one, it's also factored already. So if you set this equal to 0, I'm going to subtract 1 on both sides, and then I'm going to divide by 4. So this answer is x equals negative 1/4. And then here, I'm going to subtract 3 on both sides and divide by 2. So this is going to be x equals negative 3/2. Okay, so now they want us to try solving for x. And they already have some of these set equal to 0. Not all of them are. Okay, so I'm going to do number 2 with you. So the first thing I would do is I would get this set equal to 0. So I'm going to add 5 to both sides. So this is going to be x squared minus 11x. And if I add these two together, I'm going to have a positive 24 equals 0. Now this should be something you're familiar with. You've been doing this throughout the year for many problems that we've been working on. You're going to factor, and now that it's all factored, you're going to say x equals 8 and x equals 3. And those are your two solutions here. Okay? So I want you to pause the video and I want you to try number 1. Okay, unpause. So if you tried number 1, what you should notice is number 1 is already set equal to 0. And I have a greatest common factor here of 3. So I factor out my 3. And then here, that factors like this. Be careful with that. I need things that add to negative 5 and multiply to positive 6. So here my answers are 2 and 3. Now this 3 outside of here really does nothing for me, because if I tried to set this equal to 0, 3 never equals 0. So we're going to leave 3 and 4 for classwork practice, but what you should have noticed for 1 and 2 is that we were able to factor. Oops. Okay, but what you need to think about is we've looked at all of our polynomials so far, and not every polynomial factors. So if something doesn't factor, we can use the quadratic formula. So if you're using the quadratic formula, that's something you worked with last year. So when you use the quadratic formula, you need to have your equation set equal to 0 still. Okay, and if we look here, this is your quadratic formula. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So for my next problems, you want to make sure it's equal to 0, and then we're going to use quadratic formula to solve. Okay? So I'm going to do 1 with you. So we're going to do number 2 together. So when I look at number 2, I see it's not set equal to 0, so that's the first thing I'm going to need to fix. So that means I need to subtract 4 from both sides, and that's going to give me 4x squared plus 8x plus 3 equals 0. Okay, now this is something that I'm going to use quadratic formula with. Now, if something factors, you could still use quadratic formula, and sometimes it's easier because sometimes things have very big numbers. Okay, so remember, this was ax squared plus bx plus c. So my a is 4, because that's what's next to x squared. My b is 8, and my c is 3. So I'm going to go ahead and go and input it into my formula. Now remember, the original quadratic formula, x equals negative b plus or minus the square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So this is negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 8 squared minus 4 times 4 times 3 all over 2 times 4. So my 8 just stays a negative 8. Now, when I simplify under my radical, I'm going to put this whole thing into my calculator. 8 squared minus 4 times 3. And when I do that, I get 16. My denominator becomes an 8. This is the same as saying negative 8 plus or minus 4 over 8. Now, since these are nice numbers, I can actually break this down. So I do negative 8 plus 4 over 8, and I'm going to do negative 8 minus 4 over 8. This, negative 8 plus 4 over 8, if I add these together, negative 8 plus 4 is negative 4. It becomes negative 4/8, which reduces to negative 1/2. Okay? Here, this is negative 12 over 8, and that can reduce also. I could divide top and bottom by 4, and that's going to reduce to, let's see, 12 divided by 4 is 3, 2. Okay? So I have negative 1/2 and negative 3/2. At this point, I want you to pause the video, and I want you to try number 1. Okay, at this point, you've tried number 1 by yourself. You identified A is 2, B is negative 3, and C is negative 5. You substituted into the formula. A negative 3 becomes a positive 3. After you simplify this, you'd have 49 under the radical, and then 4 on bottom. Square root of 49 is 7. I break it down into the two cases. 3 plus 7 over 4 becomes 5/2 when I reduce. 3 minus 7 over 4, negative 4 over 4 becomes negative 1. So those are my two answers here. We're going to look at our last type of solving that you did in Algebra 1, and that's complete the square. So complete the square, I put the steps up for you because it's been a while since you've done it. So I'm going to do number 3 with you. So the first step says A must be 1. So here, this has an invisible 1 next to that, so we're good. We're going to move our C value over to the other side. In order to do that, I need to subtract 23 to the other side. I leave this blank here because I'm going to add the needed value to create a perfect square trinomial. A perfect square trinomial means that this is going to factor perfectly. To get that, you take your b value, which is negative 12, you cut it in half, that's negative 6. You square your negative 6 to get 36. Okay? Now, after you fill in that blank with your b value over 2 squared, you're going to factor the left-hand side. This factors with x minus 6 and x minus 6. These should always be exactly the same. It should always work perfectly. I add these two together. A negative 23 plus 36 is 13. I'm going to square root both sides because they wanted me to actually solve for x. So if I square root both sides, I'm going to have x minus 6 equals, I added a square root to the equation, so I need a plus or minus here. Now, in order to completely isolate x, I'm going to add 6 to both sides. So this becomes 6 plus or minus radical 13. Okay, I'd like you guys to pause the video and try number 1 yourself. Okay, at this point you've tried number 1 yourself. So that means you brought your 8 to the other side, negative 8 plus a blank to figure out what goes in your blank. You take half of your b value and square it. Half of 6 is 3, 3 squared is 9. Add 9 to both sides. This adds to 1. This I have to factor. It's going to be x plus 3 and x plus 3. We can write that as x plus 3 squared. Now remember, we wanted to solve for x, so we have to undo the squared here. To undo a squared, you take the square root. When I add a square root to a problem, I do plus or minus here for the equation. Now I have x plus 3 equals plus or minus radical 1. I have to get x by itself, so I'm going to subtract 3 from both sides. Now technically, I could do, because this 1 is something we could simplify here, negative 3 plus 1 to get negative 2, and negative 3 minus 1 to get negative 4. Okay, make sure you bring this with you to class tomorrow. We're going to go over the rest of the problems in this. And if you got it stuck on anything, draw a star next to it and we can talk about it tomorrow in class.